How did rural Americans suffer during the Great Depression? By Amy Lafferty, Cody Keenan, and Lydia Conroy.
The Great Depression was felt across the nation and around the world, although its effects were especially devastating for rural Americans. The economic collapse, environmental disaster, and social instability combined to highlight the vulnerability of farming communities and to influence attitudes towards poverty, migration, and government responsibility. Environmental concerns had previously arisen in the South with the failure of the Mississippi floodwater levees in 1927, but the extreme drought and soil erosion caused by the Dust Bowl further worsened the rural crisis. Rural Americans' livelihoods relied heavily on agriculture at a time when the farming economy collapsed violently, leading to strikes and migration. The intensity of rural suffering ultimately compelled government intervention, resulting in New Deal policies designed to stabilise agriculture and offer relief. Collectively, these factors demonstrate the diverse and severe hardships faced by rural Americans during the Great Depression.
Rochelle Putnam provides a focus on the state of Mississippi, but provides context on environmental concerns prior to the Great Depression, as well as an understanding of how government intervention provided benefits for farmers. Timothy Egan's literature was utilised as an introductory text to the project and provided real experiences of rural Americans, and highlighted how farming was viewed as a necessary form of employment, as well as private issues such as debt and the impact of technology. Donald Worster was another text which was used in the beginning of the project, primarily for understanding on the impact that the Dust Bowl had on the rural American population, including both their private lives and how legislation combated this impact. Walter J. Stein provided one perspective on migration patterns during the Great Depression and illustrated what life would have been like for Americans who were drawn to California. Stein also explored the living conditions of migrants, which aids in textualising primary sources utilised throughout the project. Paul Bonifield presents an alternative perspective to that of Stein by following a similar analysis, but in terms of rural Americans who did not migrate and chose to stay while facing harsh Dust Bowl conditions. Bonifield also explores how effective rural Americans were at adapting to the environmental and economic impacts, while also providing anecdotes of rural Americans. David Eugene Conrad aided in exploring the political aid during the period, in particular exploring the role of President Franklin Roosevelt and his actions towards improving the lives of American farmers.
During the 1930s, the Dust Bowl crisis would emerge, where much of rural America was engulfed with dust storms and a drought climate which would prevent farmers from producing crops and in turn profits. The Dust Bowl emerged in 1932 with its highest impact occurring in 1935, remaining until 1940. States which experienced the height of the Dust Bowl include southern Colorado, southwestern Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma, and northeastern New Mexico. A primary cause of the great environmental change has been attributed to the growing mechanisation of the 1920s, which allowed for a greater use of land in the south and produced a larger output of crops. The greatest economic impacts of the crisis, aside from loss of crops, can be attributed to the impact on cattle, where a variety of animals would be engulfed by the dust storms. Further consequences of the Dust Bowl would become evident through property damage. Following the height of the crisis, with numbers estimated between 3,800 in lesser circumstances, and at the worst end 288,000. More than 250,000 people fled from the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Most of the people who were particularly affected by the Dust Bowl were tenant farmers who suffered from the economic collapse, which in turn led to the migration of farmers to California due to the breakdown in the American economy. Migration was predominantly present from Oklahoma to California. These migrants became referred to as Okies. Native Californians had a negative reaction to the migration as they saw the Okies as poor and unwanted in their city. Woody Guthrie recorded the Dust Bowl Ballads, representing the Midwesterners who left for California. Guthrie became known as the Dust Bowl Troubadour and witnessed Black Sunday in 1935. This was recognised as one of the largest dust storms of the period. His songs describe the harsh conditions of the working class Okies and their new life and home.
Rain quit and the wind got high and a black old dust storm filled the sky, and I swapped my farm for a Ford machine and I poured it full of this gasoline and I started.
Rural Americans suffered economically during the Great Depression, largely due to many being financially dependent on farming, which collapsed early and recovered slowly. A major cause of rural suffering was the decline in agricultural prices. During the First World War, farmers had expanded their production, but the demand began to fall in the 1920s. By the time the Depression hit in 1929, the farm economy was already unstable, and by 1932 prices had plummeted. Cotton had fallen from 16 cents per pound to 5 cents. What had once been enough to sustain a family for a year suddenly earned almost nothing, forcing them to choose between selling their crops or using them to feed themselves. Iowa farmer Elmer Powers recorded the tragic case of a respected farmer who had committed suicide by hanging himself in his barn when he knew he was about to lose his farm to a mortgage company. This case highlights how economic pressures have put some individuals to extreme desperation. These falling prices also intensified the debt crisis. During the 1920s, many farmers borrowed money for tractors, expanding land, or to invest in technology. But once the prices fell, they had no way of repaying the loans. As a result, banks seized farms, livestock, and equipment, and losing a farm meant losing both employment and a home. Some rural communities resisted through penny auctions, described by farmer Oscar Heelan as some neighbours would bid a penny and give it back to the owners. However, these acts of solidarity could not stop the mass amount of farms that were lost due to foreclosure or land deserted by the Dust Bowl. Letters written to Mrs. Roosevelt by rural children reveal the effects on them and their families. A girl from Georgia wrote, "His mill has always been an expense. First it was a dry year with no water to grind corn with, and the next a leak in the dam. Then in the year 1933, when we had moved here, the banks closed in February. He lost everything, except the cheque for a few $100s that the bank sent him." These letters show that rural suffering extends beyond financial struggles, and the children were forced to take on adult worries.
Migrating rural Americans during the 1930s followed a similar pattern to older relatives in the sense that they were seeking greater lands to work on or to provide adequate living wages. As highlighted by Walter J. Stein and The Okia's Farm Labourer, 1975, rural Americans had been historically plagued with natural and human-based dangers which impacted their ability to produce and to profit. Migration led a portion of rural Americans towards California, including men, women, and children, who were inspired by the notion of working with crops such as cotton, fruits, and vegetables. The inevitable goal of migrating Americans was to obtain small portions of land in order to gain greater profits than they could in the Great Plains. Rural Americans living in California established settlements, otherwise known as Little Oklahomas, in which they would have to live under substandard conditions. These settlements could be found in rural areas across California, including Bakersfield, Modesto, Sacramento, Yuba City, and any other qualifying regions. As emphasised by Stein, migration occurred most prominently in 1935. While the environmental impact was severe during this time, other issues may be taken into consideration. Paul Bonifield states in The Dust Bowl, Men, Dirt and Depression, 1979, that migration was likely due to federal intervention, where the government sought to improve rural life by less effective means. However, Bonifield also points out that migration demonstrated in the 1940 census shows that over 8,000 Americans had been relocated by this period. While this is still a relatively large number of migrants, it demonstrates that the majority of rural Americans chose to stay within the Great Plains. For the population who remained in the Great Plains during the 1930s, life was made particularly difficult due to the dust storms which resided in the area, which in the worst cases caused death but overall impacted the daily life of rural Americans. Rural Americans adapted to these conditions and came together as part of their communities to find communal relief through church, sport and the arts, as well as economic relief through liquor in terms of prohibition, and cattle farming in the earlier portion of the decade.
American agriculture in 1933 was in danger of complete collapse. Farm prices had suffered and were unable to recover from the post-war depression of 1920 to 1922. The Great Depression led to crops being worthless and unable to harvest. When the new president, Franklin Roosevelt, took office, he set an agenda around the need for farm legislation. President Roosevelt introduced his New Deal agenda, which created new administrative agencies such as the Agricultural Adjustment Act and Rural Electrification Administration. This was set out to resolve challenges faced by rural Americans. The New Deal established agencies that aimed to overcome challenges such as overproduction, rural poverty, and poor farm practice, although the benefits of these agencies typically favoured largest farms. One of the most important programs is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, passed in May 1933. The AAA aimed to limit the overproduction of milk, hogs, rice, tobacco, cotton, and wheat. Although at first the deal was not well received by all farmers, the policy did help raise prices and slow down foreclosures. And by 1936, $1.5 billion had been paid out in support by the government. The Rural Electrification Administration also invested in rural electrification, which brought power, modern equipment, and new opportunities to isolated communities. Before this, states such as Mississippi lacked coal and water power, which made farm work far harder. This brought refrigeration, lighting, and modern farm equipment to the countryside, which improved farm productivity. Another key programme established in June 1933 was the Farm Credit Administration. At a time when thousands of farms were facing foreclosures, the FCA refinanced farm mortgages and gave production and marketing loans. This allowed for low-interest loans of 5%. The FCA loaned out more than $600 million nationally, with the Plains receiving a large share. This act helped to reduce the debt of farmers. Overall, these programs did not fix the issues, but they helped to stabilize the rural American agriculture and improve the quality of life of rural Americans.
This examination of the environmental, economic, and social challenges faced by rural Americans during the Great Depression revealed the mass scale and complexity of their suffering. The collapse of agricultural prices, growing debt, and mass foreclosures caused deep and lasting disruption to rural life, while the Dust Bowl further intensified the crisis by depriving families of viable land and pushing many into migration. These pressures reshaped rural communities, contributing to rising inequality for rural migrants and declining living conditions for adults and children. Although government intervention through New Deal programs offered some relief in raising prices and expanding electrification, the recovery was gradual and not sufficient for the level of suffering faced. Overall, the experience of the 1930s reveal how economic instability, environmental disaster, and social crisis collectively disrupted livelihoods and left lasting consequences in agriculture.
We found this group project as good learning experience where we improved in skills such as time management, cooperation, and to compromise. We believe having the groups picked for us was a good lesson in what teamwork in the workplace will be like, as you learn to work with people you don't know. Once we were in contact with each other, we set up a WhatsApp group chat and decided to meet after the Wednesday seminar. During our first meeting, we got to know each other and discussed which topics we were interested in and our preferences. Ultimately, we were all interested in the question, how did rural Americans suffer during the Great Depression?
Now we had a topic picked, we opted to spend our first couple of weeks researching primary sources linked to the question and put our findings on a shared Word document to keep everyone looped in. Over these weeks, we met in person roughly every Wednesday, with some online meeting as well. Our main discussion during these were to set up factors based on our reading and create a final plan. After this plan was finalised, we created a shared script document and PowerPoint for the video. This allowed to make a start on writing. We kept in communication about what has been written and supported each other on what should be added and edited out. We feel this allowed for cohesiveness and didn't push work on just one person.
As we started to make progress on writing, we moved our meeting to weekly to allow for time to be spent writing together. We also found it beneficial to create our own deadlines that would keep us on track as the deadline neared. These deadlines ranged from a date to have finished writing, to start recording, and to do the technical side of the PowerPoint. We found this helpful as our timeline allowed for extra time to edit and in case any problems arose. During the final week, we met twice online to finalise who was recording what sections, and then to have a last read through together to make sure everyone was pleased with the work to submit. Ultimately, this was a good experience for us. Even though we faced challenges with balancing other coursework, we had no problems and all worked together to get the work done.